People often think the hardest part about becoming a nurse is the long hours, or the overnight shifts, or the emotional weight of watching people fight for their lives. They're wrong. The hardest part was convincing the people I loved that caring for others wasn't settling for less. It was choosing a different kind of success. Unfortunately, my family never saw it that way. My name is Sarah. I was born into a family where achievement wasn't celebrated. It was expected. My father was one of the most respected attorneys in our city. He believed success could be measured by three things: your paycheck, your title, and the size of your office. My mother owned 2 successful real estate agencies. She believed appearances were everything. Every family photo looked like it belonged in a magazine. Perfect smiles, perfect clothes, perfect image. Then there was my older brother, Michael. He had followed the family tradition perfectly. Straight A's, medical school, future surgeon. At every family gathering, relatives spoke about him like he was already a legend. He'll save lives. He's going to make us all proud. No one ever noticed that I wanted to save lives too. Just in a different way. When I was 16, my grandmother suffered a stroke. For 2 weeks, she stayed in the hospital. I visited every afternoon after school. Doctors came and went. Specialists reviewed charts. But the people who truly stayed beside her were the nurses. They held her hand when she was frightened, explained every procedure with patience, remembered how she liked her tea. One nurse even braided her hair because Grandma had whispered that she hated looking untidy. I watched all of it. Not because I had to, because something inside me changed. That wasn't just medicine. That was humanity. On the drive home after Grandma was discharged, I quietly told my parents, I think I want to become a nurse. The silence inside the car lasted several seconds. Then my father laughed. Actually laughed. I thought you were serious. I am. He looked at me through the rearview mirror. Sarah, nurses work for doctors. You can do better. From that day forward, every conversation about my future became a debate. Dad wanted law school. Mom suggested business. Michael insisted I should become a physician. No one asked what I wanted. Whenever I mentioned nursing, the room seemed to grow colder. One Sunday afternoon, we were having dinner with relatives. My aunt smiled at me. So, Sarah, have you decided what you'll study? Before I could answer, Dad answered for me. She's still in her rebellious phase. Everyone laughed. I forced a smile, then quietly said, I've applied to nursing school. The laughter stopped. My uncle frowned. With your grades, why would you waste them? Mom sighed dramatically. I honestly don't understand. Michael shook his head. You'll spend your career taking orders. I looked down at my plate. No one defended me. Not one person. That night, I sat on my bedroom floor and questioned everything. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was making a mistake. Maybe choosing compassion over prestige was foolish. Then my phone buzzed. It was Grandma. She somehow always knew when something was wrong. Come visit me tomorrow. The next afternoon, I found her tending roses in her backyard. She smiled as soon as she saw me. You've been crying. I laughed softly. Is it that obvious? She nodded. It always is. We sat together on the old wooden bench beneath the oak tree. I told her everything. The comments, the jokes, the disappointment. When I finished, she remained quiet for a long time. Finally she asked, Do you know what I remember most from my hospital stay? I shrugged. The doctors. She smiled. No. The nurse who held my hand when I was terrified. She squeezed my fingers gently. Never confuse being important with being visible. Sometimes the people who change your life are the ones whose names you barely remember. I looked at her. What if everyone thinks I'm wasting my potential? She smiled warmly. Potential isn't measured by applause. It's measured by purpose. Those words settled deep inside me. That afternoon, I made my decision. No matter what anyone said, I was going to nursing school. The acceptance letter arrived 3 months later. I cried before I even opened it completely. I had been accepted into one of the best nursing programs in the state. I ran downstairs holding the envelope. Dad, I got in. He looked up from his laptop. To nursing school? Yes. He nodded politely. Congratulations. Then returned to his work. That was it. No hug. No celebration. No dinner. 2 weeks later, Michael received his medical school acceptance. My parents hosted a party with nearly 50 guests. There was a custom cake, balloons, champagne, professional photographs. As relatives congratulated Michael, I quietly helped refill drinks in the kitchen. No one mentioned my acceptance. Not even once. Nursing school was harder than I imagined. Clinical rotations started before sunrise. Some nights I studied until 2 in the morning. I missed birthdays, holiday dinners, weekend trips. But every patient reminded me why I had chosen this path. An elderly man squeezed my hand after recovering from surgery. A frightened child smiled because I remembered her favorite cartoon. A woman battling cancer whispered, "Thank you for treating me like a person, not just a patient." Moments like those couldn't be measured in dollars. Graduation arrived 4 years later. I invited my parents 6 months in advance. Mom said she'd check her schedule. Dad said he had an important client meeting. Michael promised he'd try. On graduation morning, I searched the audience. Rows of proud parents filled the auditorium. I kept looking. One seat, then another. My family's seats remained empty. Every single one. I accepted my nursing pin, smiling for the photographs. Then walked outside and sat alone on the campus steps. For a few minutes, I let myself cry. Not because I regretted becoming a nurse, because I had stopped expecting my family to be proud of me. As I sat there wiping away tears, someone sat beside me. Grandma. She was wearing her favorite lavender coat. She handed me a small bouquet of white lilies. I told them they were making a mistake. I smiled sadly. They didn't come. I know. She gently adjusted my graduation cap. But I did. She reached into her purse. Inside was a small silver name badge. It simply read, Sarah, registered nurse. On the back, she had engraved one sentence. The world always needs more kindness. I hugged her tighter than I ever had before. A month later, I started working in the emergency department at St. Anne's Medical Center. The first few weeks were overwhelming. The alarms, the rushing stretchers, the endless stream of patients. Every shift brought something new. Some nights were heartbreaking. Others were filled with quiet victories. An elderly woman surviving a heart attack. A young father walking out after a frightening accident. A newborn's first cry echoing through the halls. Every day reminded me that I had chosen exactly where I belonged. Meanwhile, family dinners never changed. Dad still introduced Michael proudly. Our future surgeon. When relatives asked about me, he usually smiled politely and said, Sarah's working at the hospital. Someone inevitably replied, oh, "She's just a nurse?" Dad never corrected them. He never said, "She's saving lives too." He simply changed the subject. 3 years passed. I stopped waiting for their approval. I found a new family instead. The doctors who trusted my judgment. The nurses who became my closest friends. The patients who thanked me with tears in their eyes. Little by little, I realized something. The respect I'd been searching for had never been missing. I'd simply been looking for it in the wrong place. Then came a stormy Friday night. The emergency room was unusually busy. Rain hammered against the windows. Ambulance sirens echoed through the city. Suddenly, the charge nurse rushed toward us. Major highway accident. Multiple victims. Everyone immediately sprang into action. Stretchers lined the hallway. Doctors prepared trauma rooms. The ambulance doors burst open. The first patient rolled inside. Then the second. Then the third. I looked at the first stretcher. And my entire world stopped. It was my father. His face was covered in blood. Behind him was my mother. And on the final stretcher, my brother Michael. The family who had spent years telling me my career wasn't important had just arrived in my emergency room. And whether they realized it or not, their lives were now in the hands of the daughter they had always underestimated. The emergency room teaches you one lesson faster than anywhere else. Life doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care how much money you make, or what title appears on your business card. When the ambulance doors open, everyone is simply a patient. And that night, my family learned that lesson. For one brief second, I forgot how to breathe. My father, the man who once laughed when I said I wanted to become a nurse, was lying unconscious on a stretcher. His expensive suit was torn. Blood covered the side of his face. His glasses were gone. He looked human. Not powerful. Not intimidating. Just frightened. "Sarah." Dr. Patel's voice snapped me back to reality. "I need you with trauma room 2. Training took over. Not emotion." I pushed my feelings aside and moved beside the stretcher. "Male, 59, the paramedic reported. High-speed collision. Possible internal bleeding. Blood pressure dropping." As we wheeled my father inside, I caught a glimpse of my mother. She was awake. The moment our eyes met, recognition spread across her face. "Sarah." Her voice trembled. I wanted to answer. Instead, I simply said, "We're going to take care of you." The next hour passed in a blur. 4 lines. Medication. Blood tests. CT scans. Heart monitors. Orders shouted across the room. Every member of the trauma team moved like pieces of a perfectly rehearsed orchestra. There was no time to think about the past. Only the next decision. The next patient. The next heartbeat. Michael's injuries weren't life-threatening. A broken arm. Several cracked ribs. A concussion. But my father wasn't as fortunate. He had severe internal bleeding. The trauma surgeon looked at me. "We're taking him to the operating room." I nodded, already preparing medications. As I adjusted his oxygen mask, Dad slowly opened his eyes. For a brief moment, he looked directly at me. Confusion filled his face. Then recognition. His lips barely moved. "Sarah." I gently squeezed his hand. "You need to save your strength." His fingers tightened around mine. The same man who once dismissed my career was now searching my face for reassurance. Hours passed. The waiting room filled with worried families. Rain continued pounding against the windows. Inside the emergency department, time seemed to disappear. At nearly 3 in the morning, Dr. Patel finally walked into the family consultation room. The surgery had been successful. Dad would recover. Relief washed over me. Only then did I realize how exhausted I was. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard familiar voices. My aunt, my uncle, several cousins. They had rushed to the hospital after hearing about the accident. One cousin looked at me in surprise. "Sarah, I didn't know you worked here." Before I could answer, Dr. Patel walked over. "There you are." He smiled. "I've been looking for you." He turned toward my relatives. "I hope you know how lucky your family is." Everyone looked confused. He continued. If Sarah hadn't recognized the signs of internal bleeding so quickly. He paused. "Your father probably wouldn't have made it to surgery in time." Silence. Absolute silence. No one spoke. My relatives simply stared at me. For the first time in my life, no one asked, "You're just a nurse?" Instead, they looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Respect. The following afternoon, Dad was awake. The intensive care unit was unusually quiet. Machines beeped softly around the room. Sunlight filtered through the blinds. I stepped inside carrying his updated chart. He smiled weakly. "I hear you've been taking care of everyone." I checked his monitors. "That's my job." He watched me carefully. "I didn't know." I looked up. "Didn't know what?" "How much nurses actually do." I smiled gently. "Most people don't." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Dad whispered, "Was it you?" "What?" The doctor said. "You noticed something everyone else missed." I nodded. "There were several signs. You were losing blood faster than your initial scans suggested. So I asked for another ultrasound." He stared at me. "You saved my life." I shrugged softly. "The whole team did." "No." He shook his head. "The surgeon told me. He said if you hadn't spoken up." His voice broke. "I wouldn't be here." I looked away. Not because I wanted praise. Because I wasn't sure how to respond. For years, I had imagined hearing my father finally acknowledge my work. Now that it had happened, it felt strangely quiet. Not triumphant. Just sad. Because it had taken tragedy for him to see me. Later that evening, I visited my mother. Her injuries were minor. A fractured wrist. Cuts across her forehead. She smiled as I entered. "I've been asking about you." I adjusted her blanket. "I'm okay." She reached for my hand, then stopped. Almost as if she wasn't sure she had the right. Finally she whispered, "I owe you an apology." I remained silent. I spent so many years worrying about what people would think. My daughter. She laughed sadly. My daughter was already making a difference. And I couldn't see it. Tears filled her eyes. "I am so sorry." Before I could answer, someone knocked gently on the door. Michael. His arm rested in a sling. He looked embarrassed. "I'll come back later." "It's okay." He stepped inside. For several moments, none of us spoke. Then he looked directly at me. "I watched you last night." I frowned. "When?" "Before they took Dad into surgery." "You weren't scared?" I smiled. "Oh, I was terrified." He looked surprised. "You couldn't tell." "That's because my patients need me calm." He nodded slowly, then quietly admitted, "I used to think nurses only followed instructions." He laughed bitterly. "I've never been so wrong." Michael lowered his eyes. "Do you know what the surgeon said after the operation?" I shook my head. "He told the residents, If you ever ignore an experienced emergency nurse, you're risking your patient's life. He looked back at me. I've spent years studying medicine. But last night, I learned one of the most important lessons of my career. 3 days later, Dad was transferred out of intensive care. The crisis had passed. Recovery had begun. Before my shift ended, Dr. Patel stopped me in the hallway. "You did outstanding work." "Thank you." He smiled. "I nominated you for the hospital's Clinical Excellence Award." I laughed. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. But you earned it." That evening, as I changed out of my scrubs, I looked at my reflection in the locker room mirror. Dark circles under my eyes. Hair pulled into a messy bun. Shoes worn from countless shifts. I smiled. Not because life had suddenly become perfect. Because I finally understood something. I had spent years trying to prove my worth to my family. Without realizing, I had already proven it every single day. To strangers. To patients. To people whose names I'd never remember. But who would never forget mine. The following morning, just before I left the hospital, the hospital administrator approached me. "Sarah, I received a call. From your father." I froze. "He asked if you'd come see him." I looked toward the elevators. For years, I'd dreamed of hearing those words. Now, I wasn't sure what waited on the other side. But something told me the hardest conversation of my life was about to begin. People often imagine forgiveness as a single moment. One conversation. One apology. One embrace. But forgiveness isn't like flipping a light switch. It's more like watching the sun rise. Slowly. Quietly. Without realizing exactly when the darkness disappeared. That's what happened with my family. Not overnight. But it began in a hospital room. I stood outside my father's door for several seconds. My hand rested on the handle. For years, I had imagined this moment. The day my father would finally see me. Now that it had arrived, I wasn't sure what I wanted from it. Taking a deep breath, I walked inside. Dad was sitting upright in bed. His color had returned. The bruises across his face were beginning to fade. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. Not because of his injuries. Because of me. He motioned toward the chair beside him. "Would you sit for a minute?" I checked the hallway. My shift had ended. I nodded and sat down. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "When you were little, you used to follow me around the house." I smiled faintly. "I remember. You always wanted me to look at your drawings. I usually told you I was busy." He looked down at his hands. "I thought I was building a successful career." He swallowed hard. "I didn't realize I was missing my daughter's childhood." I remained quiet. Not because I was angry. Because some confessions deserve space. He continued. "I spent years teaching you that success meant titles and salaries." His voice cracked. "But lying in that ambulance, I didn't ask for a lawyer. I didn't ask for money. I asked for my daughter." Tears filled his eyes. The daughter I spent years making feel invisible. I looked at him carefully. For the first time, I didn't see the confident attorney everyone admired. I saw an aging father realizing how much time he had lost. "I can't change what happened," he whispered. "I know. I don't expect you to forget." "I won't." He nodded slowly. "I just hope one day, you'll remember me for something other than my mistakes." A gentle knock interrupted us. Mom stepped inside. She was wearing a hospital robe and a soft wrist brace. Behind her came Michael. None of us had planned this. But somehow, it felt right. Mom sat beside Dad. Michael leaned against the wall. No one rushed to speak. Finally, Mom broke the silence. When Sarah was 8, she found an injured bird in our backyard. I laughed softly. I remember. You stayed up all night feeding it with a tiny dropper. She smiled through tears. I should have known then. Helping people wasn't something you decided later. It was always who you were. She looked at me. And instead of celebrating that, we tried to change you. Michael stepped forward. I owe you something too. I looked at him. When I started medical school, I believed doctors carried hospitals. He smiled awkwardly. Last week, I watched an entire emergency department. I realized hospitals don't run because one person is brilliant. They run because hundreds of people trust each other. He laughed quietly. And the people everyone depends on most are usually the nurses. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Michael reached into his backpack. I brought you something. He handed me a small frame. Inside was my nursing school graduation photograph. The one where I was standing alone outside the auditorium. I frowned. Where did you get this? Grandma. He smiled. She kept copies. On the back of the frame, she had written in her familiar handwriting, "The world is changed most often by quiet acts of kindness." I traced the words with my fingertips. Grandma had believed in me from the very beginning, even when no one else had. A week later, my family was discharged. Life slowly returned to normal. I expected everything to go back to the way it had always been. It didn't. The first surprise came on Sunday. Dad called. We're having dinner. I'd like you to come. I hesitated. I have work. We'll wait. When I arrived, something felt different. There were no business discussions. No conversations about promotions. No comparisons. Instead, Dad asked, "Tell us about your week." For years, no one had ever asked. I told them about a little boy who had been terrified before surgery until I taught him how to make paper airplanes from hospital napkins. Mom laughed. Michael smiled. Dad listened carefully. When I finished, he simply said, "I'm proud of you." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of everything that had been missing. Several months passed. Spring arrived. The hospital held its annual award ceremony. I almost didn't attend. I wasn't interested in recognition. I already loved my work. But my co-workers insisted. You have to come. The hospital auditorium buzzed with conversation. Doctors, nurses, paramedics, technicians. Families filled the seats. As the ceremony began, the hospital director stepped onto the stage. This year's Clinical Excellence Award recognizes someone whose skill, compassion, and leadership have saved countless lives. I smiled politely, certain it would be someone else. Then I heard my name, Sarah Collins. For a moment, I couldn't move. My co-workers erupted into applause. Dr. Patel gave me a gentle push. Go. Walking toward the stage, I noticed something unexpected. In the front row sat my parents, Michael, and an empty chair. Grandma would have loved to be there. She had passed away peacefully just 2 months earlier. She never got to see this day. But somehow, I felt like she was still with me. After accepting the award, the director asked if I'd like to say a few words. I hadn't prepared a speech, so I spoke from the heart. When people hear the word hero, they usually picture the person performing the surgery. I glanced toward the audience. But every patient remembers something different. They remember the hand that calmed them before the operation, the voice that explained what was happening, the person who stayed beside them when they were afraid. I smiled. Kindness doesn't appear on an X-ray. It isn't measured by a paycheck. But sometimes, it's the medicine people remember most. The room fell silent. Then came a standing ovation. After the ceremony, Dad walked over. Without saying a word, he hugged me. Not the polite hug he'd given relatives for years. A real one. The kind fathers give daughters when words aren't enough. I'm sorry it took me so long. I hugged him back. I know. Mom joined us. Then Michael. For the first time in decades, we stood together as a family. Not because we were perfect. Because we were finally honest. A few weeks later, Dad asked if he could visit the hospital. Not as a patient. As a guest. I gave him a tour. He met nurses from every department. He watched them comfort frightened families, coordinate emergency care, teach new parents how to hold newborn babies. He turned to me and quietly said, "I used to think I understood what this place did. I had no idea." That evening, as we walked toward the parking lot, Dad stopped beside the hospital entrance. A young nurse hurried past us toward the emergency department. He smiled. "You know, if anyone ever says they're just a nurse," he shook his head, "I'll correct them." I smiled. I think they'd appreciate that. Months later, my family gathered again for another celebration. This time, it wasn't for Michael, or Dad, or Mom. It was for me. They had organized a surprise dinner to celebrate 5 years at the hospital. There were photographs from my graduation, pictures from award ceremonies, letters from former patients who wanted to thank me. One elderly woman had written, "You probably don't remember me, but you held my hand while I waited for test results. I wasn't afraid because you stayed with me. Thank you for reminding me I wasn't alone." I folded the letter carefully. No trophy could ever mean more than those words. That night, I walked outside after everyone had gone home. The air was cool, the neighborhood quiet. I looked up at the stars and thought about Grandma. She had once told me that purpose mattered more than applause. For years, I hadn't believed her. Now I did. Completely. Because the people who truly change the world aren't always the loudest, or the richest, or the most famous. Sometimes, they're simply the ones who show up, day after day, patient after patient, choosing compassion when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, remember this. Never measure a person's worth by their job title or income. Some of the most important people you'll ever meet work quietly behind the scenes, asking for nothing more than the chance to help someone else. Respect isn't earned by prestige alone. It's earned by the lives you touch. And sometimes, the greatest success isn't being the person everyone admires. It's being the person everyone hopes is there when they need help the most. The end. Thank you.